24 hours later, on a Saturday, they were like, you're in. And so we were like, you're going to give us 20K. This is the era of 20K accelerators, but 20K for 6% of this like scribbled bar napkin. And that's how we started WorkHound.
Today, we're joined by Andrew Kirpalani, aka Kirps, co-founder and CTO of WorkHound. Andrew takes us through how he built a targeted buyer list with his bankers, why strategic acquirers valued his business differently than PE firms, and what it really feels like to give away your toys piece by piece as a founder during an exit. Whether you're years out or months away from selling, you're going to want to hear this.
We got Kirps here, and we met Kirps at Chapter X in Miami through PEF. And I feel like we both connected with you immediately. You're very open in sharing. You're quite self-aware of where you're at in the exit journey. And we were just really excited to meet you, excited to get you on our marketplace, which we're going to talk about a bit later. We'd love to hear a bit about your backstory, the entrepreneurial journey, and set the stage a little of that ecosystem in Des Moines for us.
Sure. I'm not going to go all the way back to being born in Lexington, Kentucky, but like the most condensed cliff notes. Grew up in a small town, Northwest Iowa, and then ultimately went to Iowa State University and got into computer engineering. At the time, I thought I wanted to make special effects robots for movies, but nobody told me from my small little town that you should probably go to California if you want to do that job. So I ended up going to Iowa State, got a great engineering degree, and then just kind of stumbled randomly into my first startup. It was career week. I was interviewing, and this random aviation startup that was headquartered in San Diego had some execs that were from Iowa, and they were like, we need to get some people with an Iowa work ethic, like it was very aw shucks. So came back and interviewed, and they liked me, and I was kind of at that point in my life where I was like, let's just take a flyer, right? So moved out to San Diego, like graduated May 5th, had done absolutely nothing to prepare for a move, and had to be on site in San Diego on June 1st. So this tells you, kind of where I was at. So anyway, 4 or 5 different startups, some in California, some in Iowa, really did a bunch of like weird and varied technical jobs. So I'd kind of done everything you could do on the technical side of the house, from, front end engineering, back end engineering, client facing stuff, consulting, all kinds of stuff. And then ultimately I got involved with a group called Startup Weekend. It's a 54-hour crash course on how to build a business run by an organization called Startup Weekend, which is now part of Techstars. And they're all volunteer run events. And so I attended one, thought it was great, started running the events in Des Moines, volunteer, and my co-founder, he lived here working for a fintech startup, but was running the events in Northwest Arkansas. And we kind of collaborated on some various events, and eventually he kind of came to me and said, hey, I want to put in an application for this accelerator. I got an idea in trucking. I just need someone's name to put down on the application. If I buy you a beer and explain this to you, can I just use your name on the application? And I was like, sure, whatever. I don't think, I had applied to a couple accelerators with ideas, stage stuff before, and nothing had really happened. But instead, 24 hours later on a Saturday, they were like, you're in. And so we were like, you're going to give us 20K. This is the era of 20K accelerators, but 20K for 6% of this like scribbled bar napkin. And that's how we started WorkHound.
Okay, you said that you worked in lots of startups leading up to founding WorkHound, and that you held all different kinds of software engineering roles, whether they were customer facing or totally back end. So I guess, first of all, I'm a bit curious, what did you purposely take or not take from those experiences in those startups when you were co-founding your own as CTO?
I always tell you, I'm going to share all the mistakes I made so you can go make new and interesting mistakes of your own, right? And that's sort of how I feel about those startups. So I learned a lot about kind of startup theater and how, you can get to a place where you're really running a startup kind of as almost a caricature of itself. And so the economics actually aren't working behind the scenes. You're being flashy to impress customers, but you're burning cash, all kinds of stuff. And so that first startup that I went to especially was relatively, especially in hindsight, I know this was relatively poorly run and ended up running out of cash shortly after I left. And then moved through a couple other ones where, I learned just about all the various parts of the business. I went through an organization that was very sales led at one point. So I could see where overcommitting on the sales side of things was, damaging the ability of the engineering team to execute. That's where I got the phrasing that I use now, which is sales makes promises and product delivers. And so I learned a lot of various things about how the pieces and parts of the company can work together and like where the friction can be and that sort of thing. Ultimately, the last startup before WorkHound, I got pulled from engineering over into product management, which is an even broader lens. And so it just kept making me a broader and broader student of the business, I guess. And I thought that was why I think when we founded WorkHound, I felt really confident in making that jump, is because I've kind of been paying attention to all these pieces and parts for so long.
Andrew, let me jump in because a lot of younger people will ask me, hey, should I be an entrepreneur? And I often will say, I think you need to go work for a company that is in the industry that you really like, where you could see yourself potentially starting a company and learn kind of the inner workings of the industry from a bigger place, secure a little bit of salary and create a window for you to actually jump and do this later. And I'm hearing your story that maybe the better answer is work for a startup. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the industry, but you're seeing the inner workings of what works, what doesn't, at the very early stage, that 0 to 1 moment. It seems like you took a lot from it, built confidence, and said, hey, this is actually something I can do.
Some experience, regardless, is valuable. And I would say, like, whether that's, working in an industry and getting more intimately familiar with that, or working in startups or in that context of 0-1, you're kind of you're finding a lane that you want to learn more about and growing in that lane. And so when it comes to engineering and technical work especially, there's another piece of it which I like to tell people, because I worked in various different domains. I worked in aviation, I worked the automotive aftermarket, I was in digital advertising, digital marketing for a while, worked in sort of gamification, sales enablement. So been a pretty broad lens, but what I was learning at that time was really how to not just technically engineer solutions, but how to build those solutions and then think about them in the context of, like, who are we going to sell to? What's our ICP? Like, if we're building, a product that we're targeting for a small business, we're going to build that with different feature sets than we're, targeting for enterprise, that kind of stuff.
So can you tell us a bit about WorkHound and what was the big pain point you were solving for and what was the solution?
Yeah. So I alluded to my co-founder earlier. There was a guy named Max Farrell. He had actually taken that Startup Weekend methodology and left the company he was at to kind of do a consulting firm. He wanted to kind of take that into corporate innovation. A mentor of his told him, hey man, like, you're doing the same thing that every new consultant does and saying everybody is my customer, and that doesn't work. You need to pick an industry, pick a domain. Oh, by the way, have you heard of what is happening in trucking? And so my co-founder hadn't heard, started doing research, whatever. Long story short, he goes off, kind of has his own little quest there, starts to figure this stuff out, comes up with the original idea. He brings it to me and he basically sits down, buys me that beer and says, did you know that the average trucking company has 95% annual turnover with their drivers? And I was like, 95? Are you sure someone didn't drop a decimal? Like 9.5 would be bad. No, it's 95%, which means half or worse, that's another messed up thing. If you think about it, these over-the-road trucking companies that, people are out maybe 12 weeks at a time, they'll have up to like 300% turnover. The average worker tenure for a truck driver is 90 days. He just started rattling off these statistics that were just absurd to me. And I sort of thought about it for a minute and I was like, wow, this is something that underpins the entire American economy. Like 70% of our freight goes by truck, and it's got this just crazy inefficiency in its labor market. And we started digging in to figure out maybe why that was. And he had done a lot of this research. And basically we discovered that structurally, trucking companies just aren't built to connect with their people. So most drivers are in a truck by themselves, and the only person they talk to all day is a person called the dispatcher. And that person, it just is responsible for go to point A, pick up thing B, take it to point C. And they're managing 50 people. So they're just boom, 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 get on and off the phone. There's no time for how's your kids? And, how's the family? What'd you do this week? None of that. There's no small talk. So there's no connection, or very little connection in that industry between the labor and the company. So we were like, well, nobody's listening to people. What if we just gave them a platform that they could be heard? And so basically we built a platform that did employee engagement and feedback for workers that don't sit at desks. So we wanted it to be a really seamless, frictionless experience. So we built it with SMS and mobile web. Nobody had to download an app. Nobody had to create an account. And that communication started out anonymously. So they could sort of voice any concerns without sort of any fear. But what we did was we brokered that anonymity. So we said, essentially, you are anonymous, you're in control of your anonymity. However, if your company sees your issue and thinks they could solve it, they're going to ask you if you're willing to connect, to reveal your identity and connect. And what we found was when we facilitated that interaction, 95% of the time, the driver was with the company for at least another 30 days. And that sounds kind of silly, but remember what I told you before, which is the average tenure is 90 days. So we're increasing tenure by like 30%, a third, just by having those connections, those interactions. And so, that was the sort of the core high value interaction inside the platform, but we had, other tools for broadcast messaging and two-way chats and all that kind of stuff. But really it was about connecting that workforce more with their companies and does a bunch of positive things both for the worker and the company, right? So the worker's having a better experience, they're connected better out on the road, they have better mental health, they can start to have services. Sure, there's some companies that are getting progressive are doing things like health programs, because there's a lot of health issues in that industry. And also from the company side, they don't have to recruit, hire, and train as much, but a longer tenure driver is also a safer driver. And that's a bigger thing in the industry, especially during our time. There's the rise of what they call nuclear verdicts. So crash verdicts where, families would be awarded tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Insurance got really expensive.
It's so crazy to me because I think off the cuff, you hear trucking and logistics, and it has this kind of connotation of being not so sexy or kind of heavy. And everything you're describing is so personal and how this solution is affecting people on such a personal level. And obviously that's going to have an impact on the economics.
So it's an industry that has a lot of legacy in it, a lot of history, but, it doesn't maybe move forward in either technology or even work philosophy that as quickly as other industries. But kind of that's why the gap was there, right? You can find that tension between the old and the new. And honestly, that's where the gap was to build a business.
Andrew, it seems like when we talk to founders, we tend to categorize them by the industry, and it's easy to say, oh, trucking, logistics. We have clients that do IoT and hardware and software in trucking, but this is more of an HR tech industry play, right? You've picked a specific industry to bring HR tech. So who are you selling to when you brought this to market?
Yeah. And I think this is an interesting piece about HR tech more broadly because different industries treat their HR functions. They can either be a department that fades into the background, or they can be a department that really leans in and kind of is the sort of tip of the spear when it comes to culture, that kind of thing. The experience in trucking was that they sat back a little bit more and were really there to support the rest of the organization, especially the operations of the organization. Because as I mentioned before, trucking is a pretty low margin business, but it's also a business where there's a lot of things going on at any given time. And so that operations department is often your kind of leading department in a trucking company. The other one that will come up a lot is safety. Safety carries a lot of weight in the trucking industry. And that's another thing that most people wouldn't see about this industry is that, they care about safety first and foremost, right? So we were typically selling into the operations department, often someone that would be responsible for kind of like a VP of operations, like really keeping all the trains running on time. Or the other thing that trucking does a lot of, and this is probably actually the lion's share. I'd say this is like 60+% of what we were able to. So that operations may be like 40%, 60, 70% would be into recruiting. And that sounds silly because we were really more of a retention product. We were not an ATS. We were not bringing in new applicants. But when your retention is so challenged, when you have an average tenure of 90 days, even 100 driver company, 100 truck company, which is not a particularly large trucking company, we did the math. Because it costs $5,000 to $8,000 to hire a driver, they're spending $750,000 a year on recruitment just to keep 100 trucks filled. Now, one of our largest customers was a large truck company here in the Midwest. They have, I think, 6,000 power units or something like this, and we talked to them in 2015 when we first started the company. They ended up becoming a customer much later. We long relationship with them, but they were hiring 300 drivers a week at that time in 2015. And so the recruiting team would basically say like, we'll buy anything to take the pressure off, because they like, that's just such a pace, such a cadence. And so often like a VP of recruitment would be like, hey, if you can help me make my job a little bit easier by retaining some of these workers, that's going to be really valuable to me.
And moving from those kind of sales to selling the business, we would love to hear a bit about the exit story and that process, and then kind of dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, what was the impetus? What made you go from building this company to saying, hey, it's time to put it in someone else's hands?
I learned a lot through that process, right? And I think that I, like many other founders, kind of viewed the startup as, especially when we first found the company 2015, don't know anything, as like a slow, but ideally not slow, but a slow kind of march up the line to the exit, sort of a linear, like, okay, we start at A and we go to the exit, right? And I learned that's a fairly naive view, right? And so I learned a couple of things about, timing of value, where is the company going to be, value? How do you think about where you're not just what your company is doing? And I think this was the biggest learning, was that it's not that what our company was doing didn't matter. It mattered significantly, the performance of our company, but like your company exists inside the market that you're performing in, right? And so what is your market doing? And that's going to change the value, not just of your company, but the other companies around you. And then, even up to macroeconomics, like in trucking, COVID and that kind of whiplash from that is still being felt in that industry, right? And I think that was also part of our view, which was, we did a Series A round like right before or right at the end of late 21, early 22. So this was post kind of in COVID, post-COVID. I guess we weren't fully post-COVID. But like right at the end of ZIRP, the zero interest rate policy. And so everything had been very frothy. And so we were able to, kind of secure a relatively high valuation deal. We moved into kind of the growth equity side of things at that point, we had been venture funded and we stepped into PE funding. And then that, when you go into PE, you're less looking at that like, super rocket ship curve that you're looking for in a venture business, but you're looking for that kind of consistent and more reliable growth over time. And unfortunately for us, the market turned for trucking at that time as well. And so, while we were still running a very, solid business, it was not, going to grow at the rates that we had wanted to see because the market structure had changed. Basically you had a peak of capacity in COVID, and then the trucking industry went into a 3+ year long kind of freight recessions, low rates. Everybody, tightened their belt. And we learned a lot about being, a vitamin versus a painkiller. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase. I'm sure most founders have.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be a painkiller, not a vitamin. And what we learned was that actually changes with the market, right? So when in a hot market, we're a painkiller. Like, people love us. In a market where everything is tight and there's not a lot of like play in the joints, we start to drift towards that vitamin. And so we learned, that between where we wanted the business to go and what our investors at the time wanted, it was going to be the right time to kind of transact that business and say, all right, either before or while this is a kind of an environment where we're not going to necessarily want to grow the way we want, maybe it is time to get into a bigger organization with more resources. Maybe, we had always intended trucking to be the beachhead of the business, and we had found expansion harder into other verticals. And so what we ended up doing was ultimately partnering with a company that had expansion into some of those other verticals to just be a broader offering.
That's great. And so were you approached by this particular buyer? So to backtrack, right?
Yeah.
So you take on venture capital.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to take on another round of capital. I'm guessing it's growth capital, as you categorize it as PE, right?
Yep.
And they have different sets of expectations, but you're still on this timeline, right?
Yep.
That you brought on external capital, so you got to provide a return.
Yep.
All right. So now the market is saying, hey, maybe this is the right time to think about the next partnership. What did you do to say, okay, tactically, what are my next steps here?
Yeah. I mean, we went ahead and like sat down with our investors, sat down with our board and said, what's going to be our strategy here? Are we, going to, sidestep for 3 years while we wait for trucking to fix its problems? And, we can keep this business going, but we're not going to grow in the way we want. Or is it time to look for, partnerships that are going to get us a broader audience. And we, as a board, decided on the latter. And so then we engaged a partner, no, not Exitwise, because I don't think you guys existed at that point, but engaged a partner to help us run a process and find the right buyers for the business. And we didn't cast a super wide net. We went and kind of targeted 30 or 40 firms. I mean, maybe that's wide, I don't know, but at least to start with, that were aligned with what we wanted to do, because we wanted to kind of find a strategic buyer, like I said, to expand that audience. And ultimately ran a process, had great partners, and found a buyer that was right for us and got us into other industries like retail and broader logistics supply chain and other things like that. So we found that we could serve workers that were distributed, that were hard to replace, that maybe had some kind of credentialing really well. And so we got access to a larger pool of those workers to serve.
Andrew, were you part of, your team really part of deciding who that buyer pool should be? Did you know any of these groups ahead of time? Because 30 or 40 names, it feels very targeted.
We did sit down with our bankers, with those running the process, and say, okay, here's our, we kept a spreadsheet of competitors, companies to watch, whatever. We said, hey, here are all the companies that we've been watching. It's maybe 300 or 400 companies in a sheet. And we said, here are the the ones that we really think are potential targets. What do you know about the industry? Because they had decent industry exposure as well. So they could come back and say, we think that's a reasonable list, or, hey, we should add this party. Our banker specifically was well connected in private equity. And so they added, some of the kind of next stage private equity firms to the list, which ultimately isn't where we ended up transacting, but like those were what they brought to the table. So it was kind of a partnership, which I actually think really worked well, because we had, a set of strategics and then a set of PE, and we were able to kind of see what each of those demographics, I'm going to call it, thought about the business. And what we learned was that ultimately the next stage PE firms weren't going to look at the business the same way as maybe a strategic buyer was. And the strategic buyers tended to look at it a little more favorably because they could see the connection, the idea of like what we were going to bring to the table, versus, a next stage PE might have just been looking at, EBITDA or whatever, which is not where we were going to get the price for our business.
I think you using the word partner, when you first said that, I was like, that's interesting that your banker you called your partner. And now I understand why. And I think that some founders that are listening to this really should take that page out of your playbook. You're following companies, right? You don't necessarily have to be following them for M&A, but what is going on in your industry? What are the things that are happening? Having that list, and then when it comes time to sell a business, that you're really aware and you've categorized these groups and you have a sense of who would be that strategic partner where you're an extra arrow in their quiver. And then really testing the banker. Do you know any of these groups? Like how would you add to this list? Like, you got to do your work too. And so by merging their expertise and network and your understanding of the market, you become partners. So I haven't heard somebody talk about their banker as their partner, and I'm understanding why. I think it's a good lesson.
In a lot of those scenarios, and also harkening back to that sales-led business I was talking about, there were a lot of these us and them mentalities. Like, I have to win the deal, or in order for workers to benefit, management must lose. And that just did not resonate with us as people and how we wanted to build a business. We believe that when there's a transaction, when there's an interaction between a business and the customer, like, we should both benefit. That tide should lift all of our boats, right? We should sell you a product that gives you incredible value, and you should compensate us fairly for that product. And you're going to get value out of the product. You're going to retain your workers. You're going to have a safer workforce. You're going to have all these benefits, and we're going to benefit economically from that. And everybody's happy. I started getting really into a couple different podcasts, one called Founders, especially David Senrai. He was at Chapter X 2 years ago. And so he does a lot of books around Warren Buffett and especially Charlie Munger. And the Charlie Munger quotes have really started to stick with me. And I'm probably going to butcher this, but Charlie said something like, trust is one of the most economically valuable things in the world. And I really believe that. Like, in business, you're going to be connected. Like, it's inherent. So let's find those partners that we can really trust, because that's where the value is. Most value is created in long-term relationships.
if you can kind of wrap it up in this way, what to you was most surprising about your exit journey? And then what has life looked like post-exit?
I think it's very easy for people to look at an exit like a binary state, like, oh, I am building the business, I have now exited the business. And like, oh my gosh, it is not that clean. The exits are just like building a business. The exit is a process as well, right? And so it starts out as a process where, you're generating the interest. You're at the early stage of the process. You're starting to see other people interested, and it continues to flow through ultimately, okay, we've identified a buyer. They're interested, but now we got to do diligence, right? So now we're going through we're opening up all the closets. We're looking for all the skeletons, and we've got to get in there and kind of open ourselves up, bare our souls to that buyer and hope they still like us, like it can be very fraught, right? And then also when you're exiting or when you're going through these processes, you're now going to have a transition for you as a founder, right? So you have to kind of bear the soul of the company. And then as a founder, you kind of have to bear your soul a little bit, because not only are you going to give away this thing that you spent building, like you're not just giving it away. Oh, you're giving it all away, like pieces and parts, It's especially if, for me, my experience was as the technical founder, the founder that built the product. So I'm hiring in, the next set of leadership, right? So I was running product and engineering. I'm hiring a head of product and hiring a head of engineering to replace me, doing that transition. So now I've got to, again, open up all the closets, show them where all the bodies are buried, give away all my toys, so to speak, right? And it's such a challenging personal experience, because like, I don't know about everyone, but I think most of us are kind of our harshest critic as well. We've held ourselves to such a high standard. We're out here in the marketplace. We're building this business. We're saying, hey, I'm going to go out and like force the world to submit to my will. But you're also your harshest critic, right? So you're giving away your toys. Like, I'm going to hand you a Hot Wheel car and be like, the paint's all scuffed up and the wheel falls off sometimes, and then I'm going to do it again. I'm going to hand you a Lego set and be like, oh, well, there's 3 pieces missing and I spilled coffee on the instruction book, and so you're giving away all your toys, but you're being your harshest critic as you're giving them away. And so it's just like a really mentally and personally challenging time. And that's not to say that it's wrong, and that's not to say that you're doing the wrong thing or anything like that, but it's just a challenging experience. It's very rich. And so what I really like actually about what you're doing with the Exited Founder Marketplace is that experience. It's so hard to convey to most people. Like, you can tell your friends and family about that, but they just hear, oh, you're about to make a bunch of money. Why would you have any problems at all or anything like that? And it's so much more psychologically nuanced than that. And so I was fortunate during my exit to have a couple of founder friends on my side, and they helped keep me grounded. And
I love hearing
understanding that like, I'm not the fattest kid in the gym. This happens to everybody. You're going to work through a process. And so I think kind of systematizing that, making that sort of available like as part of this process, I think is it's why I was excited to get involved, because I think I had a materially better experience and a materially better outcome because I had those people on my side. I'm going to back up just a little bit, because you did ask me something about what life had been like post-exit. And so one of the things that I did, kind of post that time, was got involved with Iowa State University Startup Hacker. So I'm an alum of Iowa State University, but they also have kind of a startup incubator. So I did about 4 cohorts up there, helping as an entrepreneur in residence, kind of helping these faculty, staff, graduate that have maybe built a technology inside the university, learn about, what it takes to run a business, what it takes to start a business. Is there even a business, for the technology that they've created? And that felt very natural to return to, because that's also, as you might remember, where I started before we started the business was in that Startup Weekend organization, which was also about connecting people in the community, helping them get a taste of the entrepreneurial journey, helping people. There's a book called Start With Why that Simon Sinek did, and we would try that a lot, or we used to go through that a lot in the incubator. And I just came to a why, like my personal why is just because it's more fun to be a pirate than to join the Navy. It's just a way to be supportive and kind of pay back the support that I got from other people along my journey. I can sit down with a founder, hear their challenges, hear what they're working on. And usually I've got something in my bag of tricks / collection of scars that can help them out. And I just like being able to share that with them and make their journey just a little bit easier, because it's not going to be easy. It's hard no matter what. But if I can kind of be a friend along the way, that's very fulfilling for me.
This is why we started this, right? You reverted back to leaning on a couple of exited founder friends when you were going through what you were going through. And when we have invite somebody on to the exited founder marketplace, not only do they have to have the capability to be helpful, they have to have founder empathy, but they also have to really understand that what they're earning here is emotional currency, helping other people. You are helping somebody who wants to be in your shoes. And it is a really tough process. We're excited that you have not only the credentials and that level of trust. I was looking up the Munger quote, and it really, really resonates. Like the trust that you will have naturally with these founders that you're helping is going to be immensely valuable as they go through not only like growing companies and getting them ready for exit, but going through the full M&A process. So really appreciate you being part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't get me wrong here. Like we all want to be economically rewarded, but one of the phrases that my co-founder and I always went with, and he coined this, but so I'll give him a ton of credit, is that you could do more with friends than you can with money. And like, that doesn't discount anything that you could do money, but like truly with friends, you can do so much. And that just that phrase, among other things that I discussed, was really kind of a driver for us in building WorkHound. So it was always about connecting people, working with not just industry partners and customers or whatever, but other founder friends, just connecting, making sure that we spent time, whether that be at, portfolio days or just seeking people out, to connect with directly, like building that like community for yourself and getting access to communities like that just gives you it's superpowers, right? You've got 19 arms and 47 eyes and you've just got the ability to see around corners now because your community can see around the corners, even if you as an individual founder can't. So friends over money.
Friends over money. Friends over money.
Well, usually that means you get some money too.
Where do you think you'll add the most value to a fellow founder selling their business on their M&A team?
So most value, obviously there's structure of deals and there's diligence and there's nuance, but what I found was what was most helpful for me, and I think where I can often be very helpful, is just that founder therapy piece of this journey. It's so challenging mentally, emotionally, and what I found was because I had these other founders on my team, because I had perspective, I was able to approach that whole process in a more Zen-like way, right? To kind of take the emotional journey, experience it, but then not let that drive decision-making and ultimately be able to do this very emotional, very psychologically challenging process in a very pragmatic and measured way that ultimately led to better outcomes.
Andrew, I have actually one last question that if you were going to do it all again today, if you were going to start over and do it all again today in the current kind of crazy AI landscape we're in with WorkHound, what would you do differently? What's one thing you would do differently? I like to ask the hard questions,
The things that we could do so much more with a company like WorkHound today because the capacity to analyze the type of feedback we were getting is so much different now. So we were getting very specialized, like mobile SMS style feedback. So a lot of abbreviations, a lot of misspellings, a lot of like weird grammar. And like we had to analyze that all the hard way, like first with people, then we're building machine learning algorithms, that kind of stuff. An LLM, I think if you started feeding that kind of data through an LLM today, you would be able to get to the insights so much faster. And then that would allow you to build a lot more on top of it. And I think that, it's going to be an interesting time for the next generation of HR tech startups because there's so much of this unstructured, messy data that you're working with that, we had to do the hard way in 2015 that like, there's an easy button now. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what they build.
Andrew, we're so happy to have you, to speak with you today, to have you featured on the Exit Founder Marketplace. We're going to link in the show notes to your profile. So founders in HR tech, logistics, B2B SaaS, trucking. But again, we talked about that big HR tech anchor here. If you want Andrew on your M&A team, you can reach out. We'll put his profile in the show notes. And we thank you so much for sharing with us. And we can't wait to do the good stuff together with you.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Exited Founder Podcast. For business owners who are looking to sell or want to ensure they're exit ready, our team is here to help you maximize your outcome. So connect with us at exitwise.com today.